It is a frozen twilight in the Antarctic summer of 1947, and somewhere on the ice, a man sits before a radio transmitter, his fingers trembling as he taps out a message that will never be completed. Picture this. The largest naval expedition in polar history surrounds him. 13 ships, 4,700 men, aircraft carriers and destroyers cutting through waters that have barely been charted. But in this moment, in a makeshift communications tent or aboard one of the vessels, a single radio operator becomes the conduit for information so extraordinary that his transmission will be severed mid-sentence, the frequency suddenly filled with static, the connection lost. What he was trying to report has been debated for more than 7 decades. Some say it was a routine message interrupted by equipment failure. Some others believe he witnessed something that threatened the official narrative of Operation Highjump, something so significant that his communication had to be stopped. The identity of this operator has been obscured by time and classification. His name appears in no official records that have been declassified. His message exists only in fragments, in second-hand accounts, in whispers passed among those who claim to have heard the original transmission or spoken with someone who did. In this documentary, we explore the mystery of the cut transmission, examine what little evidence exists, and consider what might have been so urgent, so shocking, that a trained military radio operator would risk breaking protocol to report it. You will hear the theories, see the patterns. Now, and decide for yourself whether this was simply a technical malfunction or something far more deliberate. If this journey into one of Operation Highjump's most enduring enigmas intrigues you, subscribe to explore more mysteries that hide in the static between official history and suppressed truth. To understand the significance of a cut transmission during Operation Highjump, we must first understand the role of radio communications in 1947 and the protocols that governed military operations. Radio was the lifeline of any naval expedition, the invisible thread connecting ships to each other and to the outside world. In the vast isolation of Antarctica, thousands of miles from the nearest inhabited land, radio communications were not just important but essential for survival, coordination, and reporting. Every major vessel in the Operation Highjump task force had its own communications team, trained operators who maintained constant contact with other ships, with aircraft, and with Naval Command back in the United States. These were not amateur enthusiasts tinkering with equipment. These were professional military radiomen, many of them veterans of World War II, accustomed to maintaining communications under the most challenging conditions imaginable. They had operated radios during combat, under enemy fire, in storms and darkness. They knew their equipment intimately and understood the protocols that governed what could be transmitted and what must remain classified. The communications network during Operation Highjump was sophisticated for its time. High-frequency radio allowed for long-distance transmissions back to the United States. And shortwave frequencies connected the various elements of the task force. Encrypted channels were used for classified information, and there were established procedures for different types of messages, routine operational reports, emergency communications, intelligence briefings, and weather observations. Each type of transmission had its own priority level, its own encryption requirements, and its own handling procedures. Into this carefully structured communications environment came a transmission that, according to accounts that emerged years later, broke the pattern. The exact date of this transmission is disputed. Some researchers place it in late January of 1947, during the height of Operation Highjump's activities. Others suggest it occurred in early February, shortly before the mission was abruptly terminated. So the uncertainty about the date is itself significant, suggesting that records of this transmission may have been deliberately obscured or removed from official logs. What is consistent across the various accounts is the nature of the transmission itself. According to those who claim knowledge of it, a radio operator, either aboard one of the ships or at a temporary base on the Antarctic ice, began transmitting a message that described something extraordinary. The content of this message varies depending on the source, but common elements appear repeatedly. Unusual aerial activity, objects moving at impossible speeds, encounters with phenomena that defied explanation. The operator, realizing the significance of what he was reporting, allegedly transmitted in clear language rather than using proper encryption protocols. Either because the situation was so urgent that encryption would have taken too long, or because he wanted to ensure the message could not be buried in classified channels where it might never be seen by anyone outside the immediate chain of command. What happened next is where the accounts become truly intriguing. According to the narrative that has been constructed from various sources, the transmission was suddenly cut off, not gradually faded due to atmospheric conditions, not interrupted by the operator himself, but abruptly severed, as if someone had physically disconnected the equipment or jammed the frequency. Those monitoring the transmission heard the operator's voice or the rhythm of his Morse code suddenly stop, replaced by silence or static. Attempts to re-establish contact with that particular operator or station failed. Even when communication was restored through other channels, there was no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. Official logs, when they were eventually examined by researchers decades later, showed no record of the interrupted transmission. It was as if it had never happened. But among the radio operators and communications personnel who had been monitoring frequencies that day, the story persisted. They had heard something. They had witnessed an anomaly in the usually disciplined flow of military communications. And over the years, as they left the service and felt less constrained by security oaths, some of them began to talk about what they had heard, carefully, often anonymously, adding their pieces to a puzzle that has never been officially acknowledged. But the question of why a transmission would be deliberately cut becomes central to understanding this mystery. In military operations, especially during the tense early years of the Cold War, communications were closely monitored. Officers responsible for operational security would have been listening to transmissions, ensuring that classified information was not being broadcast in clear language, that tactical plans were not being compromised, that nothing was said that might provide intelligence to potential adversaries. If a radio operator began transmitting information that was deemed too sensitive for open channels, intervention would be swift, the transmission would be terminated, the operator would be disciplined, and the incident would be documented in security reports. But here is where the mystery deepens. If the cut transmission was simply a matter of operational security, if an overeager operator had started reporting something that should have remained classified, there would be records of the incident. Court-martial proceedings, at minimum a reprimand, some official acknowledgement that a security breach had occurred. The absence of such records suggests either that they have been destroyed or classified beyond normal declassification schedules, or that the incident was handled through channels that left no documentary trail. Some researchers believe that the cut transmission was not about preventing information from reaching enemy intelligence services, but about preventing it from reaching the American public and even higher levels of the U.S. government itself, according to this theory. But something was discovered or encountered during Operation Highjump that was so extraordinary that only a very small circle of individuals was allowed to know about it. The radio operator who began broadcasting information about this discovery was silenced not to protect tactical security, but to maintain a much larger secret. To evaluate this theory, we need to consider what might have been worth such extreme measures. What could a radio operator in Antarctica have witnessed or been told about that would require his transmission to be cut and the incident erased from official records? The possibilities are limited but extraordinary. First, there is the scenario involving advanced technology. If Operation Highjump encountered aircraft or vehicles displaying capabilities far beyond anything possessed by the United States or the Soviet Union in 1947, this would have been a matter of extreme national security importance. A radio operator witnessing such craft and attempting to report it in clear language would certainly have been stopped. The existence of such technology would raise questions that the military would not have been prepared to answer. Where did it come from? Who controls it? How can we defend against it? Second, there is the possibility of discoveries related to previous human activity in Antarctica. If the expedition found evidence of German installations, whether active or abandoned, this would have had significant implications for the Cold War geopolitical situation. Yet the revelation that Nazi forces had established a presence in Antarctica during or after World War II would have been politically explosive. A radio operator reporting such a discovery would have been transmitting information that could cause international incidents, panic, or demands for military action. The suppression of such a transmission would be understandable from a political perspective, if not ethically defensible. Third, there are scenarios involving natural discoveries that had strategic value. Antarctica is believed to contain significant mineral resources. If Operation Highjump located major deposits of valuable materials, keeping this information secret would have provided the United States with a strategic advantage. So a radio operator excitedly reporting a major find might have been cut off to prevent rival nations from learning what had been discovered. Fourth, and perhaps most speculatively, there are theories involving contact with non-human intelligence. If Operation Highjump encountered evidence of extraterrestrial presence in Antarctica or made contact with entities not of terrestrial origin, this would represent the most significant discovery in human history. The decision to suppress such information would have been made at the highest levels of government and military command. A radio operator attempting to broadcast such information would have been stopped immediately, and every effort would have been made to ensure the incident left no trace. Yet each of these scenarios requires accepting premises that cannot be fully verified with available evidence. But the persistence of the cut transmission story, its appearance in multiple sources over decades, and the consistency of certain details across different accounts suggest that something unusual did occur involving radio communications during Operation Highjump. Whether that something was as extraordinary as the theories suggest, or whether it has been embellished and mythologized over time, remains an open question. The identity of the radio operator himself has become part of the mystery. In most accounts, he remains anonymous, and referred to simply as the radio operator or a communication specialist aboard one of the vessels. Some researchers have attempted to identify him by examining personnel rosters from Operation Highjump, looking for communication specialists who might have been involved in the incident. But the task force included dozens of trained radio operators spread across 13 ships and multiple temporary installations. Without knowing exactly when and where the transmission originated, identifying the specific individual is nearly impossible. There have been claims over the years from individuals who stated they were the operator in question or that they knew him personally. These claims are difficult to verify. Some have come from people with dubious credentials or histories of making extraordinary claims without evidence. That others have come from seemingly credible individuals who spoke carefully and specifically about what they witnessed, but who could not or would not provide documentation to support their accounts. One account that is circulated in alternative research communities describes a radio operator who, after the cut transmission incident, was reassigned to a different location and warned never to speak about what he had witnessed. According to this account, the operator complied with these orders for many years, living with the knowledge of what he had tried to report, unable to share it even with family. Only late in life, when he felt the urgency of passing on the truth before it died with him, did he begin to hint at what had occurred, speaking to a few trusted individuals who would later attempt to publicize his story. So another account suggests that the operator did not survive Operation Highjump, that he died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the cut transmission. This darker version of the story implies that the silencing was not just of the message, but of the messenger himself, a permanent solution to a security problem. There is no credible evidence to support this claim, and it has the hallmarks of conspiracy theory embellishment. But it persists in some versions of the narratives too, adding to the sinister atmosphere that surrounds the mystery. What can be verified is that Operation Highjump had casualties. Several men died during the expedition due to accidents, the harsh conditions, and the inherent dangers of operating in Antarctica. Aircraft crashed, equipment failed, the extreme cold claimed lives. In the context of these documented tragedies, the death of a radio operator would not have been remarkable in itself. Only if the circumstances of his death were unusual, or if the timing coincided suspiciously with the alleged cut transmission, would it merit further investigation. But without knowing who the operator was, investigating his fate becomes impossible. The anonymity that shrouds this individual may be deliberate, the result of efforts to erase his identity from accessible records. or it may simply be the inevitable result of time eroding the historical record. Either way, the radio operator remains a ghost in the machinery of Operation Highjump, a voice that briefly spoke and was silenced, his message lost to static and secrecy. The technical aspects of the cut transmission deserve careful consideration. How exactly would a military radio transmission be interrupted? In 1947, radio communications relied on vacuum tube technology. Transmitters were large, power-hungry devices that required careful tuning and maintenance. The process of interrupting a transmission would depend on whether the goal was to simply stop the signal or to actively jam the frequency. If someone aboard the same ship or at the same installation as the operator wanted to stop his transmission, the most direct method would be to physically disconnect the equipment or cut the power. This would result in an immediate cessation of the signal. Anyone monitoring that frequency would hear the transmission suddenly stop, perhaps with a brief click or pop as the circuits were broken, followed by silence. If the operator was on a different vessel or at a remote location, stopping the transmission would be more complicated. Someone would need to issue orders through the chain of command to have the equipment shut down, or they would need to deploy electronic countermeasures to jam the frequency. Jamming was well understood by 1947, having been used extensively during World War II. A jamming signal, if strong enough, could overwhelm the operator's transmission, making it unintelligible or drowning it out completely with noise. To listeners, this would sound like the operator's voice or Morse code being suddenly replaced by static, whistling, or other interference. The nature of the interruption, as described in various accounts, suggests deliberate action rather than natural causes. Atmospheric conditions in Antarctica can certainly affect radio propagation. The aurora australis, the southern equivalent of the aurora borealis, can interfere with radio signals. Solar activity can cause ionospheric disturbances that disrupt long-distance communications. Equipment can fail due to cold, moisture, or mechanical problems. Any of these natural or technical issues could explain a transmission being interrupted. But what makes the cut transmission story compelling to many researchers is the claimed pattern of the interruption. According to accounts, the operator was in the middle of reporting specific information when the signal was lost. Not at the beginning of a transmission when equipment might still be warming up and connections were not yet stable. And not at the end when the operator might have naturally concluded his message, but in the middle, at a moment when the content of the message was allegedly most significant. This timing suggests purpose rather than coincidence. Someone was listening to what was being transmitted, recognized that the information was not supposed to be broadcast, and took action to stop it. The speed of the intervention also suggests preparation. If monitoring personnel had to go through multiple layers of command to get authorization to cut the transmission, there would have been delay. The operator might have completed his message before the order came through. The fact that he was stopped so quickly implies either that someone with authority was directly monitoring the transmission, or that protocols were in place to automatically detect and suppress certain types of content. Modern researchers attempting to investigate the cut transmission face significant obstacles. The first and most obvious is the lack of official documentation. If the incident occurred as described, the records that would prove it, the communications logs, security reports, and after-action reviews, are either classified, destroyed, or were never created in the first place. Freedom of Information Act requests have yielded limited results. The documents released about Operation Highjump contain routine communications logs that show nothing unusual. Either the interesting material has been redacted, or it exists in files that have not been released. The second obstacle is the passage of time. Operation Highjump occurred more than 75 years ago. The vast majority of participants are now deceased. The few survivors who remain are elderly, and their memories, even if accurate, may be incomplete or colored by decades of reflection and exposure to the mythology that has grown around the expedition. Interviewing these individuals can provide valuable perspective, but their testimony alone cannot prove that the cut transmission occurred as described. The third obstacle is the nature of the claim itself. Proving that something was deliberately suppressed requires evidence of the suppression. But if the suppression was effective, the evidence would have been eliminated. Yet this creates a logical circularity that makes definitive proof nearly impossible. Researchers are left with circumstantial evidence, patterns of anomalies, and testimony from sources whose credibility cannot be independently verified. Despite these obstacles, the investigation continues. Some researchers have focused on analyzing the communications technology available during Operation Highjump, attempting to understand what was technically possible and what traces such an incident might have left. Others have examined the broader context of military communications protocols in 1947, looking for comparable incidents where transmissions were deliberately interrupted and attempting to understand how such interventions were documented. Still others have concentrated on interviewing anyone with connections to Operation Highjump, not just direct participants, but also family members of participants, people who worked in military communications during that era, and individuals who might have heard stories passed down through informal networks. Each approach yields fragments of information, pieces that might eventually form a more complete picture, though that picture remains frustratingly incomplete. One intriguing line of investigation involves comparing the cut transmission story with other alleged incidents of suppressed information from Operation Highjump. There are reports of photographs that were never included in official archives, of film footage that disappeared, of written reports that were classified at levels higher than other expedition documents. If multiple types of information about Operation Highjump were suppressed using different methods, this would suggest a coordinated effort to control the narrative about what occurred during the expedition. The cut transmission would be one piece of a larger pattern of secrecy and information control. The psychological dimension of the cut transmission story also merits consideration. For the radio operator himself, if the incident occurred as described, the experience must have been profoundly disturbing. Imagine being trained to maintain communications, to be the voice that connects isolated operations to the wider world, and then having that voice silenced forcibly. Imagine witnessing something extraordinary and attempting to report it through proper channels, only to have your transmission cut and your information suppressed. Yes, the psychological impact would be significant. Feelings of frustration, anger, helplessness, and possibly fear would be natural responses. If the operator was then ordered not to speak about what he had witnessed and threatened with consequences for violating that order, the psychological burden would only intensify. Living with knowledge that cannot be shared, information that might be historically significant but that must be kept secret, creates a form of cognitive dissonance that can be deeply troubling. Some researchers believe this psychological burden may be why individuals eventually break their silence, why decades after the fact, people begin to talk about suppressed information. The need to unburden oneself, to share the truth before dying, can overcome the fear of consequences or the weight of security oaths. If the radio operator or others who witnessed the incident have spoken about it in their later years, this would be consistent with patterns observed in other cases of long suppressed information gradually being revealed. For those monitoring the transmission when it was cut, the experience would also have been significant. Radio operators often developed a sense of collegiality with others in their specialty, a fellowship born of shared technical knowledge and the experience of maintaining communications under difficult conditions. If fellow operators heard one of their own being forcibly silenced, it would have been memorable and potentially unsettling. They would have recognized that something extraordinary had occurred, even if they didn't know exactly what. Now, this might explain why the story of the cut transmission has persisted in communications communities, passed from one generation of operators to the next as a cautionary tale, or simply as one of the strange mysteries of military service. The phenomenon of unofficial histories, stories that circulate among veterans and specialists but never appear in official records, is well documented. These stories serve important functions. They preserve experiences that official histories omit. They provide context that helps make sense of otherwise inexplicable events, and they create continuity and identity within communities defined by shared experiences. The cut transmission story, whether entirely accurate or partially embellished, functions as one of these unofficial histories, and a narrative that helps make sense of the mysteries surrounding Operation Highjump. The broader implications of the cut transmission extend beyond the specific incident to questions about military secrecy, information control, and the public's right to know. If the incident occurred as described, It represents a moment when military authorities decided that certain information could not be allowed to reach even military channels, let alone the public. This raises fundamental questions about democratic governance and accountability. In a democracy, the military is supposed to be accountable to civilian leadership and ultimately to the people. But accountability requires information. If information is systematically suppressed, accountability becomes impossible. Yet the tension between national security and public disclosure is genuine and complex. There are legitimate reasons to classify certain types of information: tactical plans, intelligence sources and methods, and weapons capabilities may need protection to maintain military effectiveness and prevent adversaries from gaining advantages. But the classification system can also be abused, used to hide embarrassing mistakes, cover up wrongdoing, or suppress information that would challenge official narratives. Without access to classified materials, it is impossible to know whether the suppression of the radio operator's transmission, if it occurred, was justified by genuine security concerns or represented misuse of classification authority. This uncertainty is itself troubling, as it erodes trust in institutions and creates space for speculation and conspiracy theories. The cut transmission story has become embedded in the larger mythology of Operation Highjump, appearing in documentaries, books, websites, and forums dedicated to Antarctic mysteries. Each retelling adds details, interprets ambiguities, and connects the incident to other aspects of the expedition. This process of mythologization makes it increasingly difficult to separate what actually occurred from what people believe occurred or want to believe occurred. Some versions of the story include specific details about what the operator was reporting, descriptions of craft with unusual propulsion systems, encounters with entities that were not human, discoveries of entrances to subterranean chambers beneath the ice. Yet these details are compelling and fit with other theories about Operation Highjump, but their sources are often unclear. Were they part of the original accounts of the cut transmission, or were they added later by researchers attempting to fill gaps in the narrative? The inability to trace the provenance of specific details is a common problem in investigating long-standing mysteries. Stories evolve over time, and distinguishing original elements from later additions becomes nearly impossible without contemporary documentation. Despite the challenges of verification, the cut transmission story continues to resonate with researchers and enthusiasts for several reasons. First, it is specific enough to be plausible but vague enough to allow for multiple interpretations. Unlike some conspiracy theories that require elaborate networks of conspirators and implausible levels of coordination, the cut transmission involves a single incident that could have been handled by a small number of individuals acting on established protocols. Second, it fits patterns observed in other cases where military or government information has been suppressed. The mechanisms described, cutting a transmission and erasing it from official logs, are exactly the methods that would be used to suppress information in a military context. Third, it provides a human element to the Operation Highjump mystery. Rather than abstract questions about what was discovered, the cut transmission gives us a specific individual trying to report something and being silenced. This human drama makes the story emotionally engaging and easier to connect with than dry discussions of declassified documents and geopolitical strategy. Fourth, the story has been independently reported by multiple sources over the years. While these sources cannot be completely verified, the consistency of certain elements across different accounts suggests some underlying reality, even if the details have been distorted or embellished. The question remains, what was the radio operator trying to report? The answer depends on which version of the story you examine and which theories about Operation Highjump you find most credible. If Operation Highjump encountered advanced aerial phenomena, the operator might have been attempting to describe craft exhibiting flight characteristics beyond known human technology. He might have been reporting multiple objects, extreme speeds, impossible maneuvers, or craft that seemed to enter or exit the ice itself. Such a report, transmitted in clear language, would certainly have triggered intervention from security personnel. If the expedition discovered evidence of previous human activity, perhaps German installations, the operator might have been reporting structures, equipment, or even personnel encountered on or beneath the ice. This information would have had immediate strategic importance and would have been classified at the highest levels. If the discovery involved natural phenomena with strategic value, the operator might have been reporting geological findings, resource deposits, or unique environmental features. While less dramatic than other scenarios, such discoveries could still justify suppression if they provided significant strategic advantages. If the encounter involved something truly extraordinary, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, the operator might have been struggling to find words to describe what he was witnessing. His transmission might have included uncertainty, confusion, or explicit statements that what he was seeing made no sense according to his understanding of the world. Without access to the actual content of the transmission, if it existed, we are left with speculation. But that speculation is informed by what we know about Operation Highjump, about the technologies and capabilities available in 1947, about military communications protocols. Yes, and about the patterns of secrecy and information control that characterized the early Cold War period. The cut transmission, real or mythologized, serves as a lens through which we can examine broader questions about what occurred during Operation Highjump and why so much about that expedition remains mysterious more than 7 decades later. As we consider the various theories and possibilities, we must also acknowledge the limits of what can be known. Without definitive evidence, without documentation that can be independently verified, without testimony from unimpeachable sources, we cannot conclusively prove that the cut transmission occurred or determine what it contained. We are left with a mystery, a gap in the historical record that might represent something extraordinary, or might simply be a story that grew from misunderstanding and was amplified by time and repetition. The legacy of the cut transmission story extends into how we think about information, secrecy, and truth in the modern world. We live in an era of unprecedented information access, where documents can be shared instantly, where whistleblowers can expose secrets, where the tools of surveillance and communication make secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet official secrecy persists, and gaps in the historical record remain. The cut transmission reminds us that even in our connected age, there are still unknowns, still information that is deliberately withheld, still voices that are silenced before they can speak truths that others do not want revealed. Yet whether the specific incident described in the cut transmission story actually occurred is less important in some ways than what the story represents. The possibility that our understanding of history is incomplete, that significant events have been erased from the record, that individual witnesses have been prevented from sharing what they know. This possibility should give us pause and motivate us to continue seeking truth, to continue questioning official narratives, and to continue demanding transparency and accountability from institutions that operate in our name, but often outside our knowledge. What do you think about the cut transmission? Was there really a radio operator during Operation Highjump who attempted to report something extraordinary and was forcibly silenced? Or is this story an amalgamation of rumors, misunderstandings, and the human tendency to see conspiracy where there is only confusion? The evidence is fragmentary. The sources are uncertain. The details vary depending on who is telling the story. But the core narrative persists, passed down through decades, appearing in different contexts and formats, always asking the same question: what was so important that it had to be hidden? Let us delve deeper into the world of military radio communications in 1947 to better understand the environment in which this alleged incident occurred. Radio operators in the Navy were highly trained specialists who had undergone months of intensive instruction. They learned Morse code until they could send and receive at speeds exceeding 20 words per minute. They studied radio theory, as understanding the physics of electromagnetic waves and how they propagated across different distances and through various atmospheric conditions. They learned to maintain and repair their equipment, often working in cramped spaces with minimal tools. They were taught the importance of communications discipline, the protocols that governed what could be transmitted and how it should be encoded. These men were the nervous system of any naval operation, the conduits through which orders flowed and information returned. Without them, ships would be isolated. Aircraft would be uncoordinated, and commanders would be blind to what was occurring beyond their immediate sight. The responsibility placed on radio operators was immense, and they were carefully selected and rigorously trained to meet that responsibility. In Antarctica, but during Operation Highjump, this responsibility was magnified by the isolation and the extreme environment. A ship experiencing mechanical problems in Antarctic waters could not simply call for local assistance. The nearest help might be hundreds or thousands of miles away. Accurate position reports, weather observations, and operational status updates were not just bureaucratic requirements, but potential life-saving information. The radio operators knew this. They understood that their transmissions might mean the difference between successful completion of the mission and disaster. Given this context, the idea that a radio operator would break protocol and transmit sensitive information in clear language seems unlikely unless the circumstances were extraordinary. Military discipline, particularly in the immediate aftermath of World War II, was strong. Operators knew the consequences of security breaches. They had seen men court-martialed for lesser infractions. The chain of command was clear, and there were proper channels for reporting unusual observations or discoveries. If something remarkable had been witnessed, the correct procedure would have been to report it through encrypted channels, following established protocols, allowing commanding officers to decide how to handle the information. For an operator to bypass these protocols and broadcast in clear language suggests either panic, a complete breakdown of normal procedures, or a deliberate decision that the information was so important that it had to be shared immediately, even at the risk of personal consequences. This decision-making process, if it occurred, tells us something about the mindset of the operator in that moment. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that what he was reporting could not wait for proper channels, could not be encrypted and sent through normal procedures, needed to be transmitted immediately in a form that could be received and understood by anyone monitoring the frequency. What could create such urgency? What could be so compelling that a trained military specialist would risk his career and possibly his freedom to report it? The answers proposed by various researchers and theorists range from the plausible to the extraordinary. Some suggest that the operator witnessed an accident or emergency that required immediate assistance. Yet, and that the cut transmission was not about suppressing information, but about clearing the frequency for emergency communications. This explanation has the advantage of being consistent with known protocols and does not require accepting any controversial premises about what Operation Highjump discovered. However, it does not explain why the incident would not appear in official logs or why it would become the subject of persistent rumors and alternative theories. Emergency communications would be documented, not erased. Others propose that the operator intercepted communications from another source, perhaps foreign vessels or aircraft operating in Antarctic waters, and attempted to report this intelligence. The transmission might have been cut because the information was too sensitive to broadcast openly, or because revealing that such interceptions were occurring would compromise intelligence gathering capabilities. This scenario is more consistent with the secrecy that surrounds the incident, but it still does not fully explain the dramatic nature of the cut transmission story as it has been recounted over the years. A third possibility involves internal conflict within the expedition itself. Perhaps the operator witnessed or learned about something occurring within the Operation Highjump task force that was contrary to regulations or ethical standards. His attempt to report this through open channels might have been cut by officers who did not want such information to reach higher command or become known to other personnel. Yet this scenario would explain both the suppression of the transmission and the subsequent erasure of the incident from official records. Whistleblowing, even on serious matters, is rarely welcomed by those in authority, and the military has well-established mechanisms for suppressing information that might embarrass or incriminate leaders. A fourth theory, and one that aligns with the more sensational aspects of Operation Highjump mythology, is that the operator was reporting an encounter with advanced technology or intelligence that was neither American nor Soviet. This could involve aerial phenomena displaying capabilities beyond known human technology, the discovery of installations or equipment that could not be attributed to any known nation, or even direct contact with entities not recognized by conventional science or history. According to this theory, the transmission was cut because allowing such information to become widely known would have caused panic, challenged scientific and religious orthodoxies, and forced governments to acknowledge realities they were not prepared to address. The operator, in attempting to broadcast this information, was crossing a line that powerful institutions could not allow to be crossed. His transmission represented a threat not just to military security, but to social stability and the established order of understanding. Whether this theory is credible depends on one's willingness to accept the premise that such extraordinary things exist and that governments have both the capability and the will to suppress knowledge of them. Skeptics argue that such large-scale cover-ups are logistically impossible, and that evidence of extraordinary discoveries would eventually leak despite official efforts at suppression. Believers counter that the evidence has leaked in the form of stories like the cut transmission, testimonies from witnesses, and patterns of anomalies in the official record. The debate continues, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable without access to classified materials that may no longer exist or that may never be released. Let us consider also the technology of radio jamming and communications interception as it existed in 1947. The techniques for interfering with enemy communications had been refined during World War II. Both the Allies and the Axis powers had developed sophisticated methods for detecting, intercepting, and disrupting radio transmissions. Jamming could be accomplished through several methods. The simplest was to broadcast a strong signal on the same frequency as the target transmission, overwhelming it with noise and making it unintelligible to receivers. More sophisticated methods involve broadcasting on multiple frequencies simultaneously or using directional jamming that targeted specific receivers while leaving others unaffected. The equipment required for effective jamming was bulky and power-intensive by modern standards, but it was certainly available and could have been deployed aboard the larger vessels in the Operation Highjump task force. If the cut transmission was jammed rather than simply disconnected, this would indicate a level of preparation and capability that suggests the incident was not entirely unexpected. Someone would have had to have jamming equipment ready and operators trained to deploy it quickly. This implies either that such equipment was routinely available for communication security purposes, or that there was specific concern about the possibility of unauthorized transmissions during Operation Highjump. Either explanation raises questions about what was anticipated or what was known by those planning the expedition. The psychological impact of experiencing a cut transmission, whether as the operator whose message was stopped or as someone monitoring the frequency who heard it happen, cannot be understated. For the operator, the experience would have been profoundly alienating. To have your voice silenced in the act of trying to communicate, to be cut off from the network that defines your role and purpose. It creates a sense of isolation and helplessness that would be difficult to overcome. If threats or discipline followed the incident, the operator would have been placed in an impossible position, carrying knowledge that he was forbidden to share, wondering whether he had done the right thing in trying to report what he witnessed, questioning whether anyone would believe him, even if he did eventually speak. For those who heard the transmission being cut, the experience would have been unsettling in a different way. They were observers of an event they did not fully understand, witnesses to something that violated the normal patterns of military communications. The questions this would raise, the uncertainty it would create, the sense that something was being hidden, would linger long after the actual event. These psychological residues, but the emotional and cognitive impacts of experiencing something anomalous within a highly structured environment are part of why stories like the cut transmission persist. They represent not just historical incidents, but personal experiences that demanded explanation and resolution, but received neither. The concept of information control in military and intelligence contexts is worth exploring in greater depth. Every military organization has mechanisms for controlling what information flows through its communication channels and what reaches the outside world. Classification systems define what can be shared and with whom. Communications protocols ensure that sensitive information is properly encrypted. Security personnel monitor transmissions to detect and prevent breaches. These systems are necessary for operational effectiveness and national security, but they also create opportunities for abuse. For information to be suppressed not because it is genuinely sensitive, but because it is embarrassing, challenging to official narratives, or contradictory to the interests of those in power. The line between legitimate security and illegitimate suppression is not always clear, and it shifts depending on perspective. What military leaders consider necessary secrecy, civilian oversight might consider unacceptable concealment. What one generation classifies as vital national security information, another generation might view as historical data that should be public. The mechanisms for controlling information once established tend to persist and expand beyond their original justifications. Classification categories multiply. Secrecy becomes habitual rather than exceptional, and information that might once have been considered appropriate for public knowledge becomes absorbed into classified systems where it may remain hidden indefinitely. The cut transmission, if it occurred, would have been captured by these mechanisms. Once the decision was made to suppress the information, the systems would have taken over. Records would have been classified or destroyed. Personnel would have been ordered to remain silent, and the incident would have been folded into the larger classified history of Operation Highjump, inaccessible to researchers and the public. The role of institutional memory in preserving stories like the cut transmission is significant. Official records can be classified, destroyed, or lost. But human memory persists in different ways. People remember what they experienced, what they were told, what they overheard. They share these memories with trusted friends, family members, and colleagues. Stories get passed down, sometimes accurately, sometimes with embellishment, but they survive in ways that official documentation does not. This informal transmission of history creates parallel narratives that exist alongside official accounts. Sometimes these parallel narratives are more accurate than official histories, preserving truths that were deliberately excluded from the record. Other times they are distorted, incorporating errors and fictional elements that become accepted as fact through repetition. The challenge for historians and researchers is to sort through these informal narratives, identifying which elements might reflect genuine historical events and which are products of misunderstanding or imagination. The cut transmission story has been preserved largely through informal channels. It appears in memoirs, in interviews, in alternative research publications, but rarely, if ever, in official military histories. This pattern is consistent with stories that were deliberately suppressed, but that survived in human memory, despite suppression efforts. It is also consistent with stories that never had a strong factual basis, but that filled a narrative need, providing explanation for mysteries that official histories leave unaddressed. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful analysis of sources, evaluation of credibility, and comparison across multiple accounts. Yet the geopolitical context of 1947 provides another lens through which to view the cut transmission story. The world was in transition. World War II had ended less than 2 years earlier. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was fracturing. The Cold War was beginning, though it was not yet called that. Nuclear weapons existed, their terrible power demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and both superpowers were racing to develop more powerful and deliverable bombs. In this environment of uncertainty and emerging threat, any information that might affect the strategic balance was carefully guarded. Antarctica, as one of the last unexplored regions, represented potential strategic value. If significant resources were discovered there, if strategic locations for military bases were identified, if any technology or capability was found that could provide advantage, this information would be classified at the highest levels. A radio operator broadcasting such information, even unintentionally, would be stopped and the information contained. The Cold War mindset emphasized secrecy and compartmentalization. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis, even within military and government organizations. This created situations where individuals might witness or learn about things that were not their responsibility to know, and the system would respond by suppressing both the information and the witness. The cut transmission fits this pattern. If the operator stumbled across information that was compartmentalized above his security clearance, the response would be swift and uncompromising. So there is also the question of what happened after the alleged cut transmission. If the incident occurred, what followed? Was the operator disciplined, reassigned, or silenced through more permanent means? Were other personnel who might have heard the transmission warned not to discuss it? Were changes made to communications protocols to prevent similar incidents? The answers to these questions might provide clues about what actually occurred, but they are difficult to research because the incident itself is not officially acknowledged. Some accounts suggest that increased security measures were implemented after the cut transmission, with more careful monitoring of all communications and stricter enforcement of encryption protocols. If true, well, this would indicate that the incident was taken seriously and that measures were put in place to prevent recurrence. It would also suggest that whatever information the operator was trying to transmit was deemed sufficiently sensitive to warrant systemic changes to communications security. Other accounts claim that no changes were visible, that operations continued normally, and that only those directly involved in the incident were aware that anything had occurred. This would be consistent with a highly compartmentalized response, where the incident was handled quietly by a small group without broader notification. Either scenario is plausible, and without documentation, we cannot determine which is accurate. The phenomenon of radio anomalies in Antarctica deserves mention in this context. Antarctica's unique environment affects radio propagation in ways that can be surprising and sometimes inexplicable. The ionosphere behaves differently at high latitudes. The aurora australis can create interference and unusual propagation effects. The ice itself can reflect or absorb radio waves in unpredictable ways. Operators working in Antarctica often report experiences that would be considered anomalous in other environments, signals that appear and disappear without apparent cause, frequencies that seem to carry transmissions from unknown sources, echoes and reverberations that create ghost signals. Some of these phenomena are understood and can be explained by atmospheric physics and radio wave propagation theory. Others remain mysterious. Reproducible enough that they cannot be dismissed as equipment malfunction or operator error, but not well enough understood to be incorporated into standard models of how radio should behave in polar regions. Could the cut transmission be related to these natural radio anomalies? Could what the operator experienced been a natural phenomenon misinterpreted as something extraordinary? This explanation would account for the unusual nature of the incident without requiring deliberate suppression or extraordinary discoveries. However, it does not explain why the incident would be erased from official records or why it would generate such persistent interest and speculation. The role of Admiral Richard Byrd in relation to the cut transmission has been discussed in some accounts. As the overall commander of Operation Highjump, but Byrd would have been informed of any significant incidents, including unusual radio transmissions or security breaches. Some theorists suggest that Byrd himself was on the receiving end of the operator's transmission, that he heard the report of whatever extraordinary thing had been witnessed, and that the decision to cut the transmission came from him or from his immediate staff. This would connect the cut transmission to the broader mystery surrounding Byrd's own statements and experiences during and after the expedition. Other accounts suggest that Byrd was not directly involved, that the incident occurred at a level below his immediate command, and that information about it may not have reached him until later, if at all. The structure of the Operation Highjump Task Force, and with its 3 separate groups operating semi-independently across vast distances, would have made it possible for incidents to occur in one group without immediate knowledge in the others. If the cut transmission occurred in one of the smaller vessels or at a temporary installation, the information might have been contained locally before reaching the central command. This possibility raises questions about what other incidents might have occurred during Operation Highjump that were similarly contained and never reached the level where they would be included in official reports or command logs. As we consider the various dimensions of the cut transmission mystery, we must also acknowledge the role of human nature in creating and perpetuating such stories. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We look for meaning in events. But connections between disparate pieces of information, narratives that make sense of our experiences. When faced with incomplete information or unexplained events, we construct stories to fill the gaps. These stories may be accurate interpretations of limited data, or they may be constructions that impose order on randomness. The challenge is distinguishing between these possibilities. The cut transmission story has all the elements that make a mystery compelling. It involves secrecy and suppression, suggesting that powerful forces are hiding something important. It includes a human protagonist, the radio operator, whose experience we can imagine and sympathize with. It connects to larger mysteries about Operation Highjump in Antarctica, providing a specific incident that exemplifies broader patterns. And it remains unresolved, and allowing for continued speculation and investigation. These elements ensure that the story will continue to circulate and evolve, regardless of whether its factual basis is strong or weak. For believers, the story confirms what they already suspect about Operation Highjump. For skeptics, it exemplifies the problems with alternative research and conspiracy thinking. And for those in between, it remains a puzzle that is intriguing precisely because it cannot be definitively solved with available information. The question of evidence brings us to a crucial point. What would constitute proof that the cut transmission occurred? At minimum, we would need contemporary documentation. Communications logs showing the transmission, security reports documenting the incident, testimony from multiple witnesses who were present and who can provide consistent accounts. Ideally, we would have recordings of the actual transmission, or at least transcripts of its content. We would need verification that the sources providing this information are credible and that their accounts can be cross-referenced with other evidence. None of this exists in the public domain. The documents that have been declassified about Operation Highjump do not mention the cut transmission. The few accounts that exist come from sources whose credibility cannot be independently verified. This absence of solid evidence is interpreted differently by different observers. For skeptics, it suggests that the story has no factual basis. For believers, it confirms that the suppression was effective and complete. Yet the truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. There may have been an incident involving radio communications during Operation Highjump that was unusual enough to be remembered and discussed among certain personnel. Over time, this incident may have been embellished, details added, significance amplified, until it became the cut transmission story as we know it today. The core event might be real, but the mythology that has grown around it may bear little resemblance to what actually occurred. As you consider this mystery, think about what you find most compelling. Is it the idea that a single individual tried to reveal truth and was silenced by forces more powerful than himself? Is it the suggestion that Antarctica holds secrets that governments are determined to protect? Is it simply the appealing narrative of an unresolved mystery from an era when the world was very different than it is today? Your response to the cut transmission story may reveal as much about your own assumptions and inclinations as it does about the historical reality of Operation Highjump. This is not to diminish the value of investigating such mysteries. Rather, it is to encourage self-awareness about why we find certain narratives compelling and how our pre-existing beliefs shape our interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The cut transmission story, like all enduring mysteries, serves multiple functions. It preserves the possibility that official history is incomplete. It gives voice, albeit indirectly, to those who were silenced. It challenges us to think critically about information control and institutional secrecy. And it reminds us that beneath the surface of documented events, there are often deeper currents of experience and knowledge that resist official categorization and control. The investigation into the cut transmission continues in various forms across different communities. Amateur researchers scan declassified documents looking for any reference that might corroborate the story. Veterans organizations occasionally receive inquiries from individuals seeking information about radio communications during Operation Highjump. Online forums dedicated to Antarctic mysteries maintain threads discussing the cut transmission, with participants sharing theories, analyzing available evidence, and debating the credibility of various sources. This distributed, decentralized investigation may never produce definitive answers, but it serves the important function of keeping the question alive, ensuring that if new evidence does emerge, there will be people prepared to recognize its significance and pursue its implications. The persistence of investigation also sends a message to institutions that engage in secrecy. that some people will not accept incomplete narratives, that suppression of information creates as many problems as it solves, and that the human desire for truth is resilient and creative in finding ways around official barriers. Whether this message has any practical impact on institutional behavior is debatable, but the act of continued investigation has intrinsic value for those who engage in it, providing purpose, community, and the satisfaction of pursuing truth even in the face of significant obstacles. To consider also the technological advances that have occurred since 1947 and how they might shed light on the cut transmission mystery. Modern signal analysis techniques can sometimes extract information from degraded or partial recordings. If audio recordings of Operation Highjump radio communications exist somewhere in archives, even if they are of poor quality or incomplete, contemporary technology might be able to enhance them, clarify inaudible passages, or identify patterns that were not detectable with the technology available decades ago. Similarly, advances in document analysis, including the ability to detect alterations, authenticate sources, and cross-reference information across large databases, might reveal connections or evidence that earlier researchers missed. Now, the challenge is gaining access to materials that might benefit from these new analytical techniques. If the relevant materials are classified, destroyed, or held in private collections that are not accessible to researchers, the technological capabilities are irrelevant. This creates a frustrating situation where the tools to potentially solve mysteries exist, but the materials those tools need to analyze remain out of reach. Some researchers have proposed crowdsourcing efforts to locate and digitize any materials related to Operation Highjump that might be held by private individuals, family members of expedition participants, or in small archives that have not been systematically searched. The idea is that somewhere, someone might have a diary, a letter, a photograph, or a recording that contains information relevant to the cut transmission or other mysteries surrounding the expedition. By appealing broadly to the public and making it easy for people to share materials they possess, researchers hope to uncover sources that have been overlooked. The phenomenon of parallel discoveries in alternative research communities is worth noting. Multiple researchers, working independently and often unaware of each other, sometimes arrive at similar conclusions or uncover similar information about Operation Highjump. When these parallel discoveries align, they lend credibility to the findings, suggesting that the patterns being identified are not artifacts of individual bias, but reflect something real in the underlying evidence. When the discoveries diverge significantly, it raises questions about methodology and interpretation. The cut transmission story has been independently reported by multiple sources over the years, which some researchers take as evidence of its authenticity. However, these reports might also reflect the circulation of the story through informal networks, with later accounts being influenced by earlier ones, even if the connection is not explicitly acknowledged. Distinguishing between genuinely independent corroboration and contamination through shared cultural narratives is one of the persistent challenges in alternative research. It requires careful documentation of sources, explicit acknowledgement of what is known and how it is known, and willingness to revise conclusions when new information suggests that earlier interpretations were flawed. Yet the cut transmission story would benefit from this kind of rigorous approach, but the nature of the evidence makes it difficult to achieve the necessary standards of documentation and verification. The cultural impact of the cut transmission story extends beyond those directly interested in Operation Highjump or Antarctic mysteries. It has become part of a larger narrative about whistleblowers, information suppression, and the conflict between individual conscience and institutional authority. In this broader narrative, the radio operator represents anyone who has witnessed wrongdoing or discovered important information and attempted to make it public, only to be silenced by more powerful forces. Yet this archetype resonates because it touches on fundamental human experiences and concerns: the feeling of powerlessness in the face of institutional authority, the fear that important truths are being hidden, the hope that individuals of courage and conscience will speak out despite personal risk. Whether the specific incident of the cut transmission occurred as described is almost secondary to its symbolic function. It represents a pattern that people recognize from other contexts and that connects to broader anxieties about transparency, accountability, and the relationship between citizens and the institutions that govern them. This symbolic dimension helps explain why the story persists and why it continues to generate interest even among those who might be skeptical of its literal truth. It speaks to concerns and values that transcend the specifics of Operation Highjump. Let us return to the Antarctic environment itself and consider how that extreme setting might have contributed to the cut transmission incident if it occurred. Antarctica is a place that challenges human systems and assumptions. Equipment behaves differently in extreme cold. Electronics can malfunction. Radio waves propagate in unexpected ways. The psychological effects of isolation, confined spaces, and harsh conditions can affect judgment and perception. Personnel operating in such an environment are under constant stress, even if they are well-trained and prepared. In this context, unusual incidents become more likely. An operator might misinterpret routine communications or natural phenomena as something extraordinary. That equipment might fail in ways that seem mysterious until the failure mode is understood. The combination of stress, environmental extremes, and the inherent strangeness of operating in one of Earth's most alien landscapes could create situations where normal events seem abnormal and where the boundaries between reality and misperception become blurred. This does not necessarily mean that the cut transmission was a product of error or misperception. It simply acknowledges that the Antarctic environment is conducive to experiences that are difficult to explain and that might be remembered and reported in ways that diverge from objective reality. Investigators of the cut transmission mystery must account for these environmental and psychological factors when evaluating accounts and attempting to reconstruct what actually occurred. The question of motivation is central to understanding the cut transmission story. If we assume that someone deliberately cut the operator's transmission, we must ask why. What motivated this action? The most straightforward answer is that the transmission contained information that was classified or that violated communication security protocols, and the person responsible for monitoring communications acted to prevent a security breach. This motivation is clear, rational, and consistent with military procedures. It does not require accepting any controversial premises about what Operation Highjump discovered. A more complex motivation involves protecting institutional interests or reputations. If the transmission contained information that would embarrass the Navy, challenge the official narrative of the expedition, or create political problems, cutting it would serve to contain the damage. This motivation suggests a more cynical view of institutional behavior, but it is entirely plausible and consistent with how organizations often respond to inconvenient information. A third possibility involves protecting what might be called larger truths or strategic considerations. If the transmission threatened to reveal information that government or military leaders believed the public was not ready to handle, or that would disrupt international relations or social stability, cutting it might be seen as justified by those who made the decision. This paternalistic motivation, the idea that some truths must be withheld for the greater good, is controversial but has historical precedent in various contexts where governments have concealed information they deem too sensitive or destabilizing to release. The final possibility is that the motivation was not rational or defensible, that the transmission was cut not because of legitimate security or strategic concerns, but because of personal interests, fear of accountability, or desire to maintain control over a narrative. This darkest interpretation suggests that truth was suppressed to protect those who might be held responsible for failures, mistakes, or wrongdoing. Without knowing the content of the transmission, we cannot determine which of these motivations, if any, actually drove the decision to cut it. But understanding the range of possible motivations helps us evaluate the plausibility of different interpretations of the incident. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, several key points deserve emphasis. First, the cut transmission story, whether literally true or embellished, points to genuine gaps in the official record of Operation Highjump. There are aspects of that expedition that remain classified or inadequately explained. These gaps create space for speculation and alternative theories. Second, The story illustrates the challenges of investigating historical events when documentation is incomplete and when powerful institutions have both motive and capability to suppress information. Researchers face structural disadvantages in such investigations, yea, lacking access to classified materials and having to rely on incomplete and sometimes unreliable sources. Third, the persistence of the story despite these challenges demonstrates the strength of human curiosity and the determination to seek truth even when answers are elusive. People continue to investigate, to ask questions, to share information, driven by the conviction that mysteries deserve examination and that official narratives should not be accepted without scrutiny. What do you believe? After exploring the evidence, considering the theories, and examining the context, what conclusions seem most reasonable to you? Do you think there was a radio operator who attempted to transmit something extraordinary and was forcibly silenced? Do you believe the story is a myth that has grown from misunderstanding and speculation? Or do you find yourself somewhere in between, accepting that something unusual may have occurred, but remaining uncertain about its exact nature and significance? Your conclusions will depend on many factors: your general approach to evaluating historical claims, your assessment of the credibility of various sources, your willingness to accept that institutions engage in information suppression, and your openness to the possibility that Operation Highjump encountered something extraordinary. There is no definitively correct answer based on available evidence. The mystery remains open, inviting continued investigation and reflection. If this exploration of the cut transmission has intrigued you, if you find yourself drawn to mysteries that exist at the intersection of documented history and suppressed truth, yet share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of the story do you find most compelling? What questions would you most want answered? And what evidence would convince you one way or another about what really happened? Like this video if you value investigations that refuse to accept incomplete official narratives and that pursue truth even when it is hidden behind walls of classification and institutional secrecy. Subscribe to join a community of curious minds who believe that every mystery deserves thorough examination, that questioning official accounts is not only acceptable but necessary, and that the pursuit of truth is worthwhile even when definitive answers remain elusive. The story of the cut transmission is part of a larger narrative about Operation Highjump, about Antarctica, about the early Cold War period. It's about the eternal tension between transparency and secrecy, between individual conscience and institutional authority. It reminds us that history is not fixed and complete, but is constantly being re-examined, reinterpreted, and revised as new information emerges and new perspectives are brought to bear on old questions. The radio operator, whether his story is entirely accurate or has been shaped by decades of retelling, represents all those who have tried to speak truth and been silenced. His interrupted transmission, cut off before its message could be completed, symbolizes all the information that has been suppressed, all the witnesses who have been intimidated into silence, all the truths that remain hidden in classified files or were never documented at all. In remembering this operator and investigating his story, yet we honor the principle that truth matters, that secrecy should be exceptional rather than routine, and that the public has a right to know what is done in their name and with their resources. Keep your minds open to possibilities. Keep your critical faculties sharp. Question narratives that seem incomplete or inconsistent. Seek evidence, but also recognize that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially when powerful institutions have motive and means to suppress information. The frozen continent of Antarctica still holds secrets. Operation Highjump remains one of the most mysterious expeditions in the history of polar exploration. And the voice of that radio operator, cut off in mid-message more than 7 decades ago, still echoes in the questions we ask and the investigations we pursue. Until we meet again in our continued exploration of mysteries that challenge our understanding of history and reality, stay curious, stay skeptical, stay committed to the pursuit of truth wherever it leads. Keep your minds open and remember that some of the most important questions are those that official histories leave unanswered. As you consider this mystery, think about what would convince you one way or another. What evidence would you need to believe that the incident occurred as described? And what would it take to prove that it didn't? These questions go to the heart of how we evaluate historical claims, how we distinguish between verified facts and compelling stories, and how we navigate the space between skepticism and open-mindedness. If this exploration of the cut transmission mystery has intrigued you, if you find yourself wondering what really happened in Antarctica in 1947, share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. What interpretation of the evidence seems most convincing to you? Do you believe a radio operator was silenced, or do you think this is a legend that has grown beyond any factual basis? Like this video if you appreciate investigations into the mysteries that official history leaves unexplored. Subscribe to this channel to join others who refuse to accept incomplete narratives and who believe that every mystery deserves thorough examination, even when definitive answers remain elusive. The story of Operation Highjump is vast, with many threads and mysteries beyond just the cut transmission, each element from Admiral Byrd's statements to the early termination of the mission, and from the classified documents to the accounts of unusual encounters, adds to a larger picture that remains incomplete. The radio operator, whether his story is entirely true or has been embellished over the decades, represents all those who have witnessed things they were not allowed to report, who have carried secrets they could not share, who have been silenced by systems more powerful than any individual. In remembering this operator, real or symbolic, we acknowledge that history is not just what is written in official records. It is also what is whispered in the margins, what is passed down through unofficial channels, what is hinted at by those who cannot speak directly. The truth, whatever it may be, exists somewhere in the space between what is documented and what is remembered, between what is said and what is silenced. Keep your minds open to the possibility that there are still truths waiting to be uncovered. Keep questioning narratives that seem incomplete or inconsistent, and keep exploring the mysteries that challenge our understanding of what we think we know. The frozen continent of Antarctica still holds secrets. The story of Operation Highjump is far from fully told, and the voice of that radio operator, cut off in mid-transmission, still echoes across the decades, a reminder that some messages are considered too dangerous to be heard. Until we meet again in our exploration of the unknown, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop seeking the truth that hides between the static.